meeting was held in Dubai, which is COP28, where issues around climate change, environment were discussed. And one of the key resolutions there was actually for countries to start phasing out fossil fuels. Fossil fuels means oil and other related sources of energy, including coal, which is common in developed European countries. Now, for countries like Uganda, it's an important discussion because we are planning to produce oil. What does this mean for us when such a UN conference takes a decision that we should begin phasing out? What should we be doing? Should we phase out? Should we continue producing? Or should we ignore them and do our own things like President Yoweri Museveni suggested not so long ago? So I have two people who followed closely the happenings at the COP28 meeting to discuss with us those issues. Mr. Twebaze Paul is a research fellow at the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Good evening, listeners.
Also in studio, Mr. Anthony Wolimbwa. He is the National Coordinator, Climate Action Uganda, one of the civil society organizations involved in issues of climate in this country. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, listeners.
Well, let's begin very quickly. I know very well you two gentlemen followed closely what happened at COP 28, but very quickly for Ugandans to understand just what is COP, what are these COP meetings, looking at the definition and what actually happens there. And I'll come to you, Mr. Twebaze.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think COP is a short form for Conference of Parties, and these are series of meetings, conferences, where the key players in the area of climate action meet to deliberate on issues affecting the citizens and the countries, and also make commitments on how to address the issues of climate change. So basically, COP28 means the 28th meeting of the Conference of Parties. So basically, that is what it is about. So what happened recently was the 28th meeting of Conference of Parties. So we've been counting from the first COP up to that meeting. So that means governments, global players, climate actors have been meeting for those number of times to agree on how to deal with the climate change crisis.
So they have met for the 28th time discussing these issues. And let's look at some of the key issues that have come out of these meetings. So from your memory, what comes to your mind with all these 28 meetings? What are some of the landmark decisions that we have seen in the past, even before we talk about the 28th meeting that occurred in Dubai not so long ago? Mr. Olimba.
Good evening, listeners. And first, I want to take the opportunity to thank our team, which was in Dubai, the Ugandan team, both the government team and the civil society team.
600 strong. That's what we were told.
600, but the 600
people.
Is not necessarily the government. 600 had a number of categories, some from government, some from civil society, private sector, the younger people, some from the religious institutions, from the kingdoms. There are those who carried the badges, what called party badges, then also what called party overflow. Those made the 600, but it's while it is true that 600 were accredited, I don't think all of them attended, and are not all of them government. Like, I've broken down those categories. There were a number of government people, yes, officials from the departments, ministries and agencies, and these authorities and so on. So I wanted to put that very clear. It was a misconception. I think the media was, it was the main issue picked out of the many good things that have been happening in these discussions. The numbers, in my view, shouldn't disturb you so much. And in any case, I don't speak for government. First of all, let me put a disclaimer. The these numbers, the people, actually most of the people supported themselves, although government also supported their own people. So the 600 made those different categories. Now, the COP has been here since 1992. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It has the COP, like Paul has earlier on described. So this time we had the 20th meeting or the conference of parties to the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then the 18th meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, then the 5th meeting of the conference of parties and meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. Then we had also the 59th meeting of what's called SBI and SABSTA. SBI is the subsidiary body on implementation, and then the SABSTA is the subsidiary body on science and technological advice. So there were a number of meetings that happened in Dubai from the 30th of November to the 12th of I think almost 13th, because it kind of overshot a little bit, of December.
14th. 13th,
no,
14th.
Around 13th.
All right.
Yeah, because it was supposed to end on 12th, but I think matters, negotiations the way they are, sometimes things can really get hot and you need to move until you finish. Well, there have been a number of issues that we've been trying to follow up. Initially, the previous COPs, a number of issues have been discussed. Matters concerning finance. Since Cancun, Mexico, around 2011, countries, what called parties, had agreed to raise $100 billion annually by the year 2020. And this has been a very difficult subject, financing. There are other matters on loss and damage. It is an old thing, starting way back in 1991. So countries or parties to the conference had sought to make sure that there is a declaration, first to prioritize it on the agenda, which was done some time back in Bonn in 2022. Then next was now to establish that fund. I think there was a follow-up in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt last year, COP27. Then this year, I think there was finally a declaration of that fund, the loss and damage fund. It has been a contentious issue, and also its governance mechanisms. Then there were issues on what's called the global goal on adaptation. Then there are also issues on the global stock take. How much emissions are you taking out? Each country should account for your own emissions. So countries also meant to discuss some of those issues. But coming to this COP, the COP28, there are around 4 elements from the presidency. Element 1 was fast-tracking just, orderly and equitable energy transition. Element 2 was fixing climate finance. Element 3 was focusing on people, lives and livelihoods. And element 4 was on underpinning everything with full inclusivity. So there were around 4 core issues, but within that there are many small issues that, not small, but categories of issues that needed to be discussed, decisions which are follow-up, new decisions, and emerging ones in regard to the COP. So there were those core issues or elements, 4 of them, that were brought forward. Of course, noting that some of the issues I mentioned, like loss and damage, the financing, issues of technology transfer, issues of mitigation has not been a big problem to us.
So looking at some of those issues that were agreed upon,
yes,
have any been implemented?
Yes, if you check around, a number of small actions have taken place.
Small actions,
but they all contribute to this global action. Like for the case of Uganda, there's a lot by the happening. within government, civil society, private sector. I'll give you an example within the energy sector, for example. Uganda, I think, has been at the forefront of promoting renewable energy. Most of our energy sources are renewable in nature, biomass, hydroelectric power. You have actions on solar, so what called solarization or solar power generation. You've seen a number of schemes around in eastern Uganda, in central Uganda here. So there are a lot of small actions that have taken place, but they are all contributing to the global action to reduce on emissions, and also the impacts of climate change. So, but of course, they have been done, albeit with a lot of constraints. You know, we don't have a lot of resources as a country, but a number of actions have taken place. Those that I've cited, and like actually, like in the forest sector, for example, there's a lot of tree planting going on. Tree planting and tree growing, those are two different things, but it's happening already. Individually, people are doing it on their own. Government is also doing it. Private sector is doing it. Actually, there is now heightened interest, especially with the coming on board of the carbon trade, where people are trading. In Uganda, they say tutunda mpeo, but in technical language, you are trading by way of reducing carbon emissions, either by planting trees that absorb the carbon, or by putting up things like solar plants that avoid further emissions. Or even if you check this program, you know, the program by Ministry of Works and Transport of reducing the number of years in your old cars, imported cars here. I think right now it's about 15 years. You can't import an old car. Those are some of the actions, by the way, to reduce emissions. You check another action on by NEMA on the prohibited importation of old fridges. If you remember very well, people had put it more around ozone layer depletion and so on. Those are some of the actions that are happening at the national level. In the transport industry, it's already happening. You can no longer import an old car.
And there's also a move towards vehicles that are electric.
Electric vehicles.
That policy is there.
I've seen a few. I'll not name the companies. You might charge me for an advert. But I've seen some companies during the Energy Week that have advertised some very nice cars. I have seen, there was a policy actually at one point. People don't notice it, but the Ministry of Energy, for example, at one time removed all these old bulbs. You remember the old bulbs with the wire, the incandescent bulbs? Then they moved to these new ones, the LED bulbs. You know how much it contributed? It reduced our consumption, by 50 megawatts. 50, it's a lot. That's a huge reduction. That even if you planted trees, the emissions that would have occurred, you need a huge acreage. But just by that action alone, by transitioning from the incandescent bulbs to these low consumption bulbs, it used to be 100 watts. Now you have a bulb of 3 watts, 5 watts. I think the biggest must be maybe 10 or 20 for security lights. So there are those actions that the country has taken, and they're already contributing. But of course, what we need more is to increase the financing, increasing the technology, work on issues of policy. There are a lot of policies that are happening, that are taking place within the overall environment and the energy sector. There's a lot that's happening. The renewable energy policies, I think, is in place. The climate change policy is in place. The law is in place. Now they're working on the regulations. I don't speak for government, but at least my
You've
vantage
been part and parcel of that. Those,
because I sit on some
proceedings.
of the committees that do some of those things. Yes.
So as a country, we are heading into the right direction when it comes to issues of climate change.
In my view, yes, we are taking very good steps. We are heading in the right direction. The colleagues at the climate change department are doing quite a fantastic job. It's a younger department, but there's a lot that's happening in terms of climate action.
All right, let's hear from Mr. Twebaze. We heard from Anthony about his view on where we are going, but also how COP has been meeting its obligations. One of the things that I've heard that are came out, even as Uganda was going to COP. I heard from the minister in charge of the sector. He addressed the media, and he talked about the failure by the developed countries to actually fulfill their promises. Like on this issue of the money, the developed countries, underdeveloped countries like Uganda, were actually expecting money to come from those countries to be able to put in place mitigation measures to deal with climate change. But the money has not yet come. Are we getting any value from these COP meetings? Let's even look at the decision they took, the overall decision they took. They're trying to tell us we can no longer, we should actually not be considering producing our oil, which everyone is looking at with a lot of expectations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, the concept of changing from or addressing climate change by reduction of emissions from the fossil sectors has been on for time. But what I see as a key product of this COP28 is that most of the discussion rotated around, of course, as my colleague said, around financing and extension of finance, and then energy transition, of course, just fair and orderly transition, meaning transiting from the use of fossil fuels to green and greener energy technologies, and that's where you're talking about having phase down of use of fossil fuels, including oil and gas. And then one other key important area is about focusing on people's lives and livelihood, and our other colleagues term it as leaving no one behind in the whole climate change ambitions agenda. Now, but what is very clear is that we are not on the same level in terms of the current status. First of all, on who emits more, and then who emits less, and then the difference in the levels of energy consumption, energy demands, energy distribution patterns, and all this. So for me, the discussions, of course, we are moving towards a direction that is healthy, but I think the speed is still a little bit low, but also there is still a clear need to understand and take into consideration the different levels of development of these countries. When you talk about finance, it would not be fair to talk about and say the developing countries need to shift immediately without extending the necessary financing to facilitate their transition. Because first of all, we wouldn't see the reason why they are blamed on emissions where they contribute the lesser percentage. So the point here is that as we try to talk about energy transition, we need to talk about a transition that is fair and just, that takes into consideration specific country circumstances, so that we don't talk about immediate shift. Because, for example, when you look at Uganda, when you say Uganda should stop the development of its fossil fuel sector and then shift to alternatives without financing, then that would be actually unfair. We wouldn't be talking about a just energy transition, because we are still talking about over 80% of Ugandans using biomass as a source of energy, and that is not, even if by the biomass currently is scarce. The other day you saw a presidential ban on production of charcoal in northern Uganda, specifically I think is Western Ireland and northeastern Uganda. And you know what that has translated into at the end of the day. We have had a situation where the enforcement wings and enforcement officers of government have even misinterpreted that to arrest everyone that is found with charcoal, even when it is one bag. So as we talk now, we are talking about a bag of charcoal coming to 180,000 shillings, And I think the initial plan was to try to minimize the rate of forest degradation. But currently what is happening is that alone is increasing the degradation of forests, and therefore at the end of the day we will be losing. And of course, when we talk about the fairness and the just component of energy transition, you need to leave no one behind. We are talking about inclusiveness. We needed to have had a discussion with those that are affected. We need to talk about the users of the energy themselves. We need to talk about a local woman in Kitgum who is still suffering from accessing firewood, walking 7 kilometers to access firewood, and you are telling her to transit from firewood to another cleaner source of energy that this person cannot afford. First of all, it is tricky to afford the firewood itself. So the point has been transit from where we have not been. So for me, when you look at Uganda's position currently in terms of the whole debate of energy transition, whereas the country is trying to do quite a lot of interventions to achieve its climate commitments and ambitions, but we still have to make sure we don't do it in a bad way. We have to follow some steps. Those colleagues of ours that are already industrialized followed a certain procedure to be where they are. For us, we are still very poor, and I think saying that we stop the production of oil and gas would be wrong at this time, because we still need the money. And the thinking is that if we develop the oil and gas sector, sold the oil, got the money, we would be able to have the finances to invest in the greener energy options.
In other words, we should be allowed to first destroy the environment and then get the money to actually address the damage we have caused. But we'll dig deeper into that discussion, because that's what it literally means. Allow us first to do what we want to do and then get the money to remedy the situation. Is it possible? Or is there a sustainable way we can actually exploit our fossil fuel, fossil energy, and also protect the environment? Let's go for a break. When we return, Mr. Twebaza, we will begin from there with you responding to that issue, whether indeed we can have a win-win situation. Stay tuned to Radio 1 FM 90. Spectrum continues after this break.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.
Get ready to experience the enchantment at Sheraton Kampala Hotel, your ultimate destination for the season of seasons. Begin your celebration at Seven Seas Restaurant with a delectable seafood feast. Raise a glass at Equator Bar, savoring the festive delight in every sip. Satisfy your sweet tooth at Temptations Cake, where joy takes a delicious form. Immerse yourself in the lobby's enchanting vibes, where the holiday spirit, accompanied by Christmas carols, comes alive. Sheraton Kampala Hotel invites you to experience the season of seasons like never before. Book your unforgettable holiday retreat now. Call us at 0312-322-499 or visit reservations at SheratonKampala.com. Sheraton Kampala Hotel, your home for the holidays.
Terms of business with Housing Finance Bank and meet your business needs with ease. Get unsecured bid bonds of up to 500 million shillings within 24 hours. That's not all. Housing Finance Bank is also offering other short-term facilities, including performance guarantees, advance payment guarantees, contract financing, export and import financing, invoice discounting, and so much more. Contact our trade finance team today on 0417-707-595. You can also call our contact center on 0800-211-082 or WhatsApp 0771-888-755 or visit any of our Housing Finance Bank branch nearest to you. Housing Finance Bank, we make it easy. Housing Finance Bank is regulated by Bank of Uganda, and customer deposits are protected by the Deposit Protection Fund up to 10 million Uganda shillings. Terms and conditions apply.
It's time to break new ground. To get up and be counted. To take your seat at the table. To make your mark. Now is the time. To boss up, hustle up, level up. Take your business to the next level. Sign up for the online NSSF High Innovator Women Accelerator before 15th January 2024. Visit highinnovatorsbusinessacademy.nssfug.org to upskill yourself and stand a chance to win up to 75 million shillings in seed funding. The High Innovator program is an initiative of NSSF in partnership with MasterCard Foundation, implemented by Outbox.
NSSF, a better life.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.
Well, thank you very much for staying with us on Spectrum, live on Radio 1 FM 90. Our topic of discussion today is the key outcomes of the COP28, this means for Uganda, a country that is preparing to produce oil at a time when the global players are actually saying, go slow, phase out, and consider renewable energy. Very first, before I go to Mr. Wolimbwa, I wanted us to respond to that issue where we are planning to produce our oil, but they're telling us we are going to cause a danger to the environment. How do we strike a balance? Can we strike a balance? Can we actually be allowed to produce, then finance renewable energy at another level? And are we likely to do that? Because even right now, we are told we have more hydroelectricity, but the connections have remained low several years down the road.
Yeah, I think reducing emissions requires an integrated effort, and that's why we are saying that you do not have to say that leaving oil in the ground will help you achieve the climate ambitions for Uganda, and therefore you must do whatever it takes to make sure you combine approaches that will, at the end of the day, make a contribution to emission reduction. Of course, that's what we're saying, that you have to deal with interventions in the energy sector specifically, and that is where we have what we call sustainable exploitation or sustainable development of Uganda's oil and gas sector. And that would mean striking a balance means that you have to use some efficient technologies that do not compromise the environment, because the whole system is actually integrated. If you minimize or use technologies that minimize harm on environmental resources, then at the end of the day you are contributing to emission reduction. If, for example, you are doing approaches that minimize risk on ecological resources and therefore leave our resources thrive, you are contributing basically to emission reduction. So it is possible that we can strike a balance between oil development and also emission reduction, because we are not only looking at oil as the major source of emissions. If, for example, we did that, but also tried to increase access to energy, tried to also invest in increasing the forest cover, we would provide an offset. And the other thing is about the interventions that are already in our transport sector. Those are all integrated efforts to make sure we balance the two. So it would be very wrong to say that we stop the development of Uganda's oil and gas sector, then remain very poor, and at the same time we cannot afford to have the finances to invest in the other energy options. Because what you see, by the way, now, when you look at Ugandans, even the hydroelectricity affordability is still a problem. We are talking about rural electrification, increasing access to power is still a problem, and all these problems are rotate around resources. They rotate around failure to have the money to invest. And actually, you realize that most of the poor people can be destructive. So we only need to first lift our people out of poverty, so that at the end of the day, they can even, by the way, transit by themselves. I know if you can afford electricity, there wouldn't be any reason for going for firewood. But in a country where a minister still has to send a driver to carry a sack of firewood from Moroto, drive it to Kampala on road, that means even the minister is poor, has not the capacity, has not capacity to afford the other options. We have had cases reported in media where our members of parliament have been found stealing electricity for me, that is not only a matter of greed, but that means that they also have issues of affordability. So the whole point here is that actually the minister the other day summarized it and requested for an opportunity of the first in who can come out, and then some of us who entered late will also come out later, so that we will also follow a sequence and first benefit from our resources instead of saying we stop. The other problem, by the way, is about the cleaner technologies that are being promoted. You realize at the end of the day that they can also they cannot stand alone, and the shift cannot be instant. So we have to follow a certain process to be able to reach there. Transition is not a one day. We have to follow a certain pattern.
Mr. Olimba, your views on transition, but also you wanted to recap some of the key issues that we have gained from COP. Maybe we'll come back to that particular issue towards the end of this discussion about what we have benefited so far.
Okay.
Let's look at the issue of transition.
Yes.
What's your view? Can we strike a balance? Are we able to actually do things without hurting the environment and then produce our oil?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. First of all, sometimes I engage myself in environmental and social impact assessments. There is not a single project that has 100% positive things or 100% negative things. Always, you will establish, you will find on the scale you have maybe 1 to 10, maybe about 6 positive things, 4 negative things. Do you stop the project? No, you don't stop. What we look out for is to deal with the bad elements of the projects. So if, say, you are going to give you a project like these big hydroelectric power dams, like Jagari, for example, it's a very good thing, producing renewable energy. But at the same time, it contributes to emissions, methane, because you pour water for a very long time then. So do you stop it for that reason? No. You look for a solution. How do you deal with the methane? Can you offset it? That's the point. And for the oil and gas, can you offset? Can you deal with the negative impacts? Can you avoid, if the pipeline is supposed to pass through a wetland, can you find an alternative? Pass it on dry land. If it was a forest, can you find an alternative? If it was going to displace thousands of people, can you maybe increase the length and maybe bypass a community? Or if it is near an ecologically sensitive area. So normally, of course, the challenges with those projects, why people fear them, sometimes there's a bit of negligence maybe from either the governments or the proponents for this case, the ones who promote them. So that's why the problem is. But it is very possible that you can have, say, an oil project, but with the less impact on the environment. I know, like for the case of Uganda, there's been an argument that we are going to increase our emissions. It may not necessarily be true. What is true, of course, is the more oil you get out of globally, it might increase, but within our territory, that may never be possible because you still have the same consumption and the same pattern of growth for some time. I know this may look very controversial to some people. But what I have seen and what I have engaged in, I think there have been a lot of efforts, for example, to clean up. But there still remain a number of issues to be dealt with. But the point is, you can strike a balance, although sometimes it is very expensive. And that's why any businessman will take the cheap option. And that's why the biggest problem is that the businessman may avoid those safeguards which Paul is talking about. But it is very possible, albeit at a high cost, that can be done. Now, just imagine if you were in the Gulf states. I was in Qatar some time back. So the question was, you want us to get away from oil. Okay, you compensate us the billions of dollars to our economy. No one has the answer. We've been pushing for climate finance. It's not coming. The 100 billion per year, it's not coming. If I give you the figures here, they are very small, the commitments just made. Maybe we'll come to it at a later point. Yeah, but the point is, things can be done in a way that you have profits, you save the environment, you also improve the livelihoods of the people.
All right. Very quickly, you people are widely traveled. You've been to some of these countries, or you've engaged with officials handling environmental related issues. As the developed world keeps on telling us to phase out, are they doing the same? Are they doing what they're telling us to do? Or this could be another aspect of geopolitics. They're trying to push us because they want us to remain where we are. So that probably will continue begging, because oil will come with a windfall, some good money that can stop us from being perennial beggars.
Okay, yeah, actually, that's a very good question. They are pushing us, but are they doing the same? I can assure you, by last year, actually at the start of the Ukraine-Russia war, there has been a lot of interest in African oil. A lot of new contracts have been signed. Those for production, exploration, and what's the other one? And prospecting. So, and that's why the unfairness sometimes comes about, that they are telling us to stop, but again they are coming very fast to look for new oil wells in Africa. Now that's the unfairness that we are talking about. So they are telling, please, Uganda, stop, but behind the scenes, the oil industry actually, the fossil fuel industry is actually growing. And that has been a major concern. We said, if everybody is going off, let everybody what?
Go off.
Go off. Let's find the resources, we all go 100% renewable. But here, you are pushing us. Is it just? So you want us to, you push us, and before you realize you are heavily indebted. Countries like Uganda actually are heavily indebted because you have to borrow money to build these big dams. It's a huge cost to our economy. What if you allowed us to develop systematically, step by step? Okay? The little money that we have, we invest it in the renewable energies. Slowly, we will get there actually. But if we suddenly stop, say, okay, we just move to the other side, that's deadly.
All right.
It's catastrophic.
Mr. Twebaza, your view on that?
Yes,
are they doing what they are telling us to do?
I don't think they are entirely doing what we want.
They want us to do.
What they want us to do. Because quite often you even realize, I know that they still, when you looked at when the conflict broke out between Ukraine and Russia, we have instances of where they were also squeezed and some of the countries backtracked on their commitments. We started seeing even some of the coal plants that had been abandoned being revived. And it is on record that during winter we had even some countries resort even to firewood, even in Europe. So whereas they say this is the way to go, we find that in some instances they also backtrack. And for me the point would be, why then should they not contribute the necessary financing if we are in full gear transition? But of course we also know that some countries, of course,
why should we push them to actually provide us the financing? The local interventions we can take.
Because you see,
as a country,
the local interventions have been there. By the way,
we are even failing on the little, like telling people to get out of the wetlands.
Let me tell you one thing. Transition has always existed, and as a matter
in
of,
a natural way.
As a matter of fact, transition will always exist. Even though we have transited from what we used to do in the Stone Age era, and we have improved over time. Actually, the question of energy transition, we are saying that the speed at which we move must increase. That's when we'll make a difference. Other than that, the speed at which climate is changing and the speed at which climate shocks are increasing is too high to resonate with the change in which we are adapting and doing things in a better way. So that's why it becomes very hard to contain the emissions. But in terms of transition, human beings have always been in transition. Now, the reason why we need them to commit on financing is that if they need us to move in a certain speed, at a certain rate, let them facilitate that increment. in speed. That's the whole point. And why should they say rush, move from stage one to another before or without facilitating that? And yet we are not the biggest emitters. Actually, we are being blamed for what we did not do. And that is why we are talking about fast-tracking a just, orderly, and equitable energy transition that
right.
takes into consideration loss and damage. Who damaged? Who is responsible?
All right.
So those who did more harm are supposed to compensate in a way of facilitating the ones whose contribution was less.
All right, we have some comments that are coming in from the listeners. One of the listeners actually writes in and says, Henry, is called Henry, says, kindly guide me on how I would benefit from the carbon credit facility from pollution, from the pollution, e.g. economies. I have planted trees. I'm looking at that facility to up my afforestation drive. That is his comment there. Then somebody else says, well done, Kenneth, let the penalty spell at least 2 NDCs to achieve SDG 13. Transition is cool per se, but from where do we transit from? That is Henry also listening in from Chiwenda. Another comment, good evening, Kenneth. The arguments about transition from the climatic conditions we have found ourselves in is misplaced. Unless until we understand that relationship between nature and the growing population and increased bad business practices we the world is adopting, and then we are not understanding the entire issue. He says, countries like ours are behaving like uncivilized societies of Stone Age. That is comment there. Sadly speaking, Uganda is a rich country but corruption bound. The responsible officials in the oil sector and other government institutions have already gotten their financial shares by by fidgeting with the figures and doing shoddy work. The president has done less in dealing with these officers. That's Peter in Mobende. Somebody else writes in and says, you know that all money is stolen, then asking for money for transition. How will the financing be handled? The money we're asking for is likely to be stolen. That's what this listener is actually saying. But very quickly, let's also try to advise the Ugandan government. How can it meet its commitment, even as you respond to some of these comments that have been put across by the listener? I'll begin with you, Mr. Olimba.
Okay, yeah. Of course, from the civil society point of view, we've been pushing government to improve on the transparency issues, the reporting, because under the Paris Agreement, it is required that all governments report their actions, especially in the NDCs, the national determined contributions, or what's called in layman's language, the Climate Action Plan for Uganda. So, transparency, whatever action you take, report. Whatever money you receive, report. And like, for example, the GCF, they are very strict. Any issues of corruption, if they notice that there's any element of corruption, they can withdraw those funds. So the issues around the enhanced transparency within the entire process. So government must adhere to that at all times. You move away from that, dead. Then, of course, issues of corruption, those must be dealt with. Otherwise, climate action, you don't need any slightest form of corruption. Because it's small amounts of money, it's additional money actually, on top of what you've been having. So if you mess that up, you are back. So we are encouraging government to strengthen the transparency and reporting framework around climate change issues. When they do that, then we are going to have a better action on climate issues, yes.
Very quickly, Mr. Twebazi.
Yeah, of course, there is a question about access to credits, and I think that has been one of the key areas that thought they would benefit, and most of them actually have rushed to plant trees in a view of benefiting from these credits. But we have to realize in ground is that there is still limited guidance from our government on how to deal with carbon credits. By the way, there is even not yet a legal framework to support climate financing. Someone would easily argue that even now carbon financing. Currently, what is being done is even done without a legal framework. It is at risk and could be rendered even illegal. So for me, the first thing is to fast track the enactment of carbon financing legal framework to support that area to access, promote access to finance, and then also try as much as possible bring everyone on board. When you look at one of the key commitments or outcome areas of COP28 is about inclusiveness. Inclusiveness, paying attention to issues of livelihood, of course, that extend to elimination of hunger, because someone talked about even failure to have food. Climate resilience, food systems is also a key component, and sustainable agriculture practices. So all these combined require that the government puts in place effort in trying to make sure we improve in almost all these areas. Our farmers don't know what it means, and it doesn't make sense whether you come here and speak too much English when actually the people who are doing most of the contributions are in our villages. You're talking about transiting, but those are the people that are the engines of transition. So as long as we leave them out in the debate, then we are not talking. And that's why for Uganda, of course, Uganda launched its energy transition plan in Dubai. And of course, one of the major considerations is to allow it develop its Uganda's oil and gas sector to be able to finance the other tenets of transition. But the point is, we've said that the plan should be owned by Ugandans. It's not a matter of getting a few consultants here and then you say you have developed an energy transition plan for Uganda. We need this plan to be disseminated. We need the wananchi, the local people on the ground, to understand what is in this plan, what they should do, what adjustments they need to make, what are the alternatives to the sources of the current energy, so that they are able to support government in transitioning. Otherwise, if we keep the debate to the elites, the experts, the energy practitioners, the oil companies will not win.
Anyone who can share some information about carbon credits? Somebody else also.
Maybe.
Mubanza Hagai here right now. Thank you for the great show. Carbon credits compensation is another form of Trojan horse for continued neo-colonialism. That's another comment there.
Kenneth, okay. First, the government is making the carbon trade regulations.
So we do not yet have the regulations in place.
Yeah, we have a draft. I am part of the committee, which is
making the
technical,
regulations.
the task force. So there's actually there are about 4 regulations which are being drafted, but so far they prioritized the carbon trade regulations. Also, there is a transition from the CDM, the Carbon Development Mechanism, to Article 6. Article 6 now under the voluntary trading mechanisms as provided for by the Paris Agreement. So there people have been given up to 31st. I've seen a circular here from the PS, up to 31st December to move from the old system to the new one. But yeah, the issues around carbon trade is, once the regulations are made, then the issue of the Trojan horse may not arise. Right now, it's a bit problematic because the market has not been regulated, and everybody is running round without a clear information. But there will be regulations and which will guide the sector. I wish the government people are here to explain that. But there are regulations.
Very quickly, as we come to the end of the show, your closing remarks, Mr. Twebazi.
Yeah, for me, for us to be able to achieve, of course, we believe that government is doing or has put in place a significant effort to make sure we fulfill our commitments as Uganda, but we also need to do more in terms of increasing stakeholder involvement, trying to disseminate such plans, increasing access of information to the local citizens, because we have realized that for us to achieve or to fast track a just, order and equitable energy transition, we must leave no one behind.
Mr. Walimbwa, your closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much. And my closing remarks, there was an issue which was not addressed. Did you get anything from the COP28? Yes, Uganda achieved quite a lot. The team which was in Dubai did a lot of work. There are a lot of benefits. I'm sure when the head of delegation communicates, there are good projects that will come online, especially in the energy sector.
All right.
But I also want to call upon everybody, the government, the private sector, and individuals, me and you. Please, whatever action you can do, please put it on the table and let's have the action.
All right. The aim is actually to deal with the threat of climate change that we have seen in different forms in our country. I've been your host, Kenneth Lukwagandason. Up next, we have the news in English with Miss Josephine Dakano. Thereafter, we'll have the Soul Train with BB Junior.